Welcome to a brand new episode of NoHacksMarketing podcast. And we are all about website optimization here, and you cannot optimize what you don't measure. For most people, the default way to measure is Google Analytics. And there's been some news in that space. The beloved UA or Universal Analytics will be going away, about to be replaced by GA4. So if you are one of the millions of people who will be affected by this, stick around. This episode is for you because my guest today will tell you all you need to know about GA4 and the transition from UA to GA4. Web analytics education legend, Julian Joneman, founder and chief instructor of Measure School, is joining me today. Julian, I'm proud to say this. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So before we start talking about GA4 and details and all that, how do you personally feel about this change?
Well, I think it's an opportunity, first of all. So obviously, change is always hard. If you have a new technology, we all need to always get used to new technologies all the time. But this is a very sudden change, so it feels for a lot of people a little bit uncomfortable. But in my industry, I think there are a lot of growing pains with the old analytics, and we kind of have other pressures from different other sides, like the privacy restrictions that are coming into play from the legislation side, but also from company side. And the consumer obviously also wants to have their privacy defended. And
Right.
yeah, Google Analytics has kind of one part that you can change is the technology itself. And Google Analytics has made strides forward on that one. And so I'm kind of looking forward to this change, although it will not be easy.
I definitely agree with that. This is a complete mindset shift. They're basically taking away a toy that people are used to, like an easy to use, simple interface that people are comfortable with, and replacing it with this new thing that no one really knows enough about. That's how I feel at the moment. So tell me about, before we dive in, tell me about Measure School and a bit of your background. How did you end up in web analytics world?
Yeah, so I started out my career in digital marketing. I helped to build a few startups here in Germany. And then I, at some point, went out on my own and wanted to tackle a field that I was always interested in, which was web analytics at that time. Nowadays, you would call it more digital analytics or tracking. And I went out on my own and started helping others to install or set up Google Analytics, but also get value from the tool, actually. The thing that I then realized was it's really, really hard to get value from data that you don't really have acquired yet, because tools always need to have customization. So kind of specialized in that field of helping people to install Google Analytics and utilizing all the customizations that there were. Especially when Google Tag Manager came out, I was at that point I was really happy that this tool existed, because we as marketers, as maybe normal people, can obviously also influence a tool and customize it. And at some point I started teaching that, and that became my full-time occupation, my full-time passion, really. Started a YouTube channel, courses around this. And nowadays we run Measure School on YouTube, still the YouTube channel, as well as a website called measureschool.com, where we teach people the data-driven way of digital marketing, as we call it, everything of what you would need to be tracking to build your digital marketing up to a level that is actually data-driven.
That is awesome. And yes, all the links will be in the description to you listening to this podcast. Although, if you heard of NoHacksMarketing, I'm sure you heard of Measure School already. Let me just throw that out there. One thing you mentioned in your website, you said data-driven. One phrase that caught my eye is data-drowned versus data-driven. I think that is extremely important. As a person who is debloating websites, that's kind of my career outside of this podcast. I'm removing bloat from websites, and a lot of the bloat is because, hey, this script can capture some data for us. So can you tell me what data drowned is to people who may not be aware of it?
Yeah, in the end, we always try to capture data that's meaningful to us, but then also turn it into something valuable. Now, a lot of the approaches out there in the last few years oftentimes were such as, hey, I want to get as much data as possible into my platform. And that is, a new tool comes out and you look at this tool and you say, wow, this can give me this data now. And I have now heat maps and I have all of these different data sources. Now I'm am I data driven now? Well, not exactly, because you need to still turn it into something valuable for yourself and make decisions upon your data. And that's when you really want to be looking at what data don't I really need? What do I need in order to have meaningful data and that I can turn into something? So sometimes an analytics setup, a customization of an analytics setup involves cutting out a lot of that data crust and having that data available that you actually would need. So we always try to focus on, first of all, knowing what are the questions that the client, that a user tries to answer with his analytics tool, and does this tool provide that? Can we maybe build it in order to get that data? And then how can we make that into something meaningful? And only also stay focused while you're doing analysis, while you're diving into the tool, not getting distracted by the thousands of reports that are in the old Universal Analytics, for example. Right. The new GA4 doesn't have that many reports just yet. So yeah, we can also talk about a little bit when we think about UA going over to GA4. They have made some very conscious decisions of that they don't provide, for example, a very rigid structure anymore on how to implement something, but a more flexible structure, more flexible data model that you really need to think before you implement Google Analytics 4 and customize it. What do I actually want to track here? What are the metrics that I need to have in my system in order to make decisions later on? So it takes a little bit of more focus, a little bit more intention while you are implementing, rather than just setting up Google Analytics and it tracks it automatically for you.
I think that is the biggest and probably the best change in GA4. It forces you to think before you start tracking. Like that, I mean, we're used to it being wrong with Universal Analytics, because just slapping that snippet, Google Tag Manager, directly on the site, and then, you know, I'm, like you said, I'm data driven. Like, yeah, I know my page views, I know my, like, whatever. That's just not web analytics. Web analytics is something you can take action on and you can make decision based on, but it will be a big mindset shift. Like that's the way I see it for a lot of people. Now, okay, we talked about Universal Analytics going away. Let's get to the eulogy part. Like the announcement was made in March this year by Google. They said, I mean, it was going to happen at some point because we knew it was going away. So July 1st, 2023, no new hits in Universal Analytics. So people have, this will be out in May 2022. There's a lot of time. Like there's 14 months to transition. So tell me about, like, why are they killing it in 2023? Why not let it run? Like, what does it mean for websites who are currently using Universal Analytics?
Yeah. So first of all, why are they killing it? I guess one thing is the developers that Google has, they want to concentrate and focus on one product. It obviously takes time to maintain an infrastructure that is quite old. And then this free model of always having data available for everybody going back 10 years, there has been a lot of crust over the years that you can accumulate there. So what they will do is, first of all, they will shut down the tracking process, so you won't be able to track new hits in there, but they're also going to shut down the interface at some point, so you won't be able to, a few months later, they say, won't be able to access your old data even anymore, right? So that is something that everybody needs to keep in mind. I think another way that you could look at this is the privacy changes that are going on in Europe and the world, really. If Google has data on their servers that potentially would make them vulnerable in terms of the privacy restrictions, they want to get rid of that data at some point. And so they will shut down this old interface and have that new kind of GA4, which is a little bit more privacy conscious and has some restrictions in it built in automatically, so nobody can make a mistake in that sense. So there's probably one reason why they have pushed that forward over the last few years already, because a version of Google Analytics 4 was out already before 2020. So it was called App Plus Web. It was then changed over to Google Analytics 4. And the unfortunate thing that Google did is calling it an update, or you're upgrading from Universal Analytics to GA4. The first thing that we need to understand is that GA4 is a completely new tool. It's not something that you can just say, I'm going to have a new interface and still find my data that I had in Universal Analytics. It's a completely new tool with completely new metrics, completely new paradigm, data model, and there's a lot to get used to. So if you would be saying, hey, I want to change over to another tool like an Adobe Analytics, for example, that would also require you to read the docs, to go through tutorials to find out certain things. So right now, I would say the change for a lot of people will be to, first of all, set up Google Analytics 4. And you want to probably do it now because you want to get used to that new tool. At the same time, you want to start tracking data because, as everybody knows, Google Analytics will only track forward. You cannot say, oh, please get me data from the last 3 years. If you implement it now, at least for the next year, you will be able to do a year-on-year analysis, right? So what happened 1 year ago? And that is something you probably want to already start setting up. But Universal Analytics is not yet gone, so you can still rely on that data. And a lot of circumstances, it still makes sense to rely on that data because at the same time, Google Analytics is quite new. It's not yet completely fully built out. Google is putting a lot of effort and energy into developing new features or making sure that there are at least comparable features available from UA to GA4. And then we'll hopefully see in this next year that we'll have a comparable tool to UA. Right now, it's, it is still something to get used to. I would say it this way.
And there is no way to export UA and import in GA4. Like that is not an option. That's never going to happen, right?
That is not an option. I don't know if Google is going to announce something at some point. Who knows? Right now, if you have only if you're a GA360 customer, you will be able to get your raw data out through BigQuery. That is obvious. That is a feature in GA4 that is now introduced in GA4 that you can export your raw data. But for the old analytics, you won't be able to export your data through BigQuery. You would be able to use the reporting API and download it into a Google Sheet, for example, or also into BigQuery. But the format will be slightly different. And I don't know if everybody will be doing this. I think also there are some vendors out there that will be helping out at some point because it's a need right now. Yeah,
it is a need, but for a lot of people, and this goes back to how UA was used by most website owners. I'm not talking about web analysts. Like, you start a website, you hear about there's this web analytics tool, Google Analytics. Everyone's using it. I'm slapping it on my site. I don't even think about what it's tracking. Like, I need a hammer. This is a toolbox. It has a hammer inside it. So I'm looking at my page views and sessions and I'm happy because I'm getting more traffic. This is how I would say more than half of web analytics properties are actually used. Like a massive overkill. Like it's just not necessary. And if GA4 gets people not to do that and not to track all the data and share it with Google, I think that is a great step in the right direction. Again, Google had its hand played by mostly European Union. I would say thank you, Germany, for leading the way there for a privacy better world. Well, I mean, you guys, I remember GDPR. That was like with German websites, that was a very, very serious issue. Like not everywhere, but in Germany, I remember that was a huge issue. It should have been, like, rightfully so. So the best way to start with the transition really is set up a GA4, run it in parallel with Universal Analytics for now. Just compare, see if the data matches, if you installed it properly. You'll, like you said, you'll have a year of data when Universal Analytics is dead. So let's talk about some differences. What are the different? You mentioned data model. It's kind of different with UA and GA4. What are the main differences? Like, what are they changing other than the fact that this is more of a sandbox that you need to build yourself and just create the tracking for yourself?
Yeah. One caveat on this one, first of all, so I'm saying you need to be more conscious of your tracking. At the same time, Google Analytics 4 has some features built in, like enhanced measurement, which will automatically track certain things like a scroll or outbound link click and so on. But going beyond that, you kind of need to think a lot about your tracking itself. So the elephant in the room, I guess there's a lot of elephants in the room, but there's a lot of different feature changes. So again, you need to think about it as a new tool that you're actually using. Yes, it's still a tracking code that you install on your website, but going from there, customizing certain things will require a little bit more thought. And the first thing that we need to talk about is the new data model that is out there. So Google Analytics, Universal Analytics, was mainly based on page views that you send in. It formed a session out of it, a user. So there are different tracking hits that you could send into Google Analytics, Universal Analytics. And that was based off the understanding that we are tracking a website here. Now, the big upgrade with GA4 is that it's a measurement system and a measurement model that is built on this new world of app tracking, but also web tracking, so that you can combine data. And that needs, you cannot call it a page view on a mobile app, for example. And that's why they came up with this concept, or it's kind of something that other tools like a Mixpanel have been doing for years, event tracking. So you would just have an event that you send in to the platform of GA4, and you can send different properties with this. So properties are descriptors of that event. So you could send, and this is what Google Analytics does by default, send a page view over to GA4. And then a descriptor would be, for example, the page title or the URL and so on.
Right.
Now,
so it's mostly event, like everything is an event in GA4. That is one of the key differences, right?
Yeah. And if you think about it, nothing too much changes if you're just tracking page views, right? But now the cool thing comes in when you have a website that is not standard, that is, you don't really care about page views. Let's think of a SaaS app, right? You don't really care about how many people viewed a project page or something. You want to know certain interactions, like how many projects were created, or how many people were invited to the app, or how many connections have you made, depending on what the app actually does. So you come up with your own model of what is meaningful to you, and you can now dynamically send that into the system, into GA4, and analyze it there. This was always very, very hard in UA to do, as UA was always based on, hey, you have a website, you have a blog, okay, or you have an e-commerce store, we can take care of you. But anything outside of that scope was really hard to model inside of GA4, Universal Analytics. So GA4 is completely open and more flexible. But again, you need to think about what is actually meaningful data to me, and how do I send that in? And you need to do it in a way that is correct in the end, so you can actually analyze your data and have good data quality at the same time.
So does that mean that there will be, I'm guessing, probably more work for web analytics consultants, setting things up, developing the measurement plan and all that?
Right. So in the first sphere of like just setting up Google Analytics, I think every website owner will still be able to do that themselves, and they get enhanced measurement. So some stuff will be tracked automatically. So you have a really good base tracking, but anything above that, when you really start customizing and taking your analytics seriously, and this is like the key, as you alluded to, a lot of people just want to have the base tracking and they use Google Analytics as a stats counter, right? Now with GA4, if you want to go beyond that and actually want to have value from your data, then you need to start thinking about this. And I think there is when you start getting more mature in your data usage, and that's when you probably want to get some help, or want to get educated about this topic in order to do it correctly.
I never heard anyone say stat counter, but that is exactly what I had here. I just didn't have a word for it. So it's a glorified stat counter for, I would say, 50% of properties on Universal Analytics, based on what I've seen.
Yeah. And there's maybe a point that I can make is, like, privacy-wise, a lot of people are now looking at, is Google Analytics illegal? Is Google Analytics 4 even better? We are still sending data over to the US. So sometimes the easy answer is like, okay, are you using Google Analytics just as a stat counter? Maybe you should use another free tool that is also still a stat counter. You can see your page views, because maybe you're not using your data to the fullest effect, and maybe you shouldn't be putting so much energy and time and money into the tool. But if you are, then if you still want to utilize Google Analytics as something that you connect to AdWords, for example, and make awesome data happen, then maybe you want to be thinking analytics a little bit more seriously and customizing your implementation, and then maybe a GA4 makes sense.
I guess it does. I mean, anything that makes you think before you're using the tool for its, like you said, UA is just from 10 years ago. And the model is a 10-year-old model where everyone had a blog and maybe there was some store, like e-commerce store, and it just works for that. Everything else, custom funnels, anything custom, other than dimensions and metrics, which are great, but they're not really that advanced and fancy. You can't do with UA. Like you have to really be creative or use something else, or it just wasn't a tool for 2022. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people listening to these podcasts are CRO people who usually work in e-commerce space. How does e-commerce tracking differ? Like, is it still possible? That's the first question in GA4.
Yes, it is still possible. The enhanced e-commerce tracking in Universal Analytics was always like a standout feature. Unfortunately, this is transferred over to GA4, so we have kind of the same metrics and data that we can put into GA4. Unfortunately, it's not yet at that point where we have all the data visible in the interface and be able to query it. There's also some features that the community is kind of pushing for. We'll see if they get introduced. The thing is, for e-commerce, I guess we are able to look at our data from that perspective, but Google Analytics was always very good as an e-commerce tool. Now it's like it tries to stay away from a specific business model and says, okay, we are an open tool. So it sometimes makes it a little bit unintuitive to query the data and actually see where did the user come from and did he convert and so on. So Google Analytics 4 is also probably a tool that Google wants to have as a hub. So it's a measurement tool. You send data in, but analyzing it, you might want to do outside. So they have some really cool new features like BigQuery export. So you can export your data to BigQuery, and you can utilize this data warehouse solution from Google to analyze your data. You can obviously also utilize Google Data Studio, which is a tool for UA, but also for Google Analytics 4. And that said, we may see that Google Analytics is still used by the web analysts to do quick analysis and look into data. But in terms of reporting, in terms of actually doing meaningful analysis, you might be using outside tools. So
right.
Yeah, it might be a little bit different from your workflow, going from, especially for e-commerce, going from Universal to GA4.
It definitely sounds like they're trying to sort of push away the basic users who just use it as a stat counter. And why they're doing that, maybe they just want to cut costs, want to have fewer users, or maybe it's the privacy issues. Maybe they have this revolutionary new tool that will save them by killing the old tool. Like maybe that's what it is. I guess no one, lawyers might know. Anyway, another thing I want to talk to you about is, if you want to start planning your transition today, of course, signing up for a GA4 property, installing it, that's the first step. But how do you really start using, like, what's the setup process like?
Yeah, so I would agree that you want to be setting up Google Analytics and Universal Analytics still in parallel. So you have Universal Analytics installed, install for your client or for yourself GA4. It will send data over to GA4 and to Universal Analytics. Now, the next part would then be to actually let data run in and see how this new interface actually looks. We need to get used to what data actually comes in. The thing that a lot of people are talking about are the data differences. So Google in GA4 got rid of some metrics. For example, the bounce rate doesn't exist anymore. And now we have engagement time on that we can analyze, for example, which makes more sense. And the question then is, okay, how can I actually compare this data? Well, you can't really, right? There's different data, there's different metrics, and the measurement also works a little bit different. So the processing of the data might be different. So you will see a lot of differences in your data, and you can't just say, okay, this kind of matches up and we can go from there. It will be completely different data, but the trend is your friend, we always say, right? We look at trends. We all know that universal analytics wasn't perfect. GA4 will also not be perfect. Web analytics or digital analytics as a whole, tracking is not perfect because we have different technologies, ad blockers out there and so on. So once we got over this fact, we need to start using the tool. And I think one thing that we can measure our proficiency in is how often do we actually utilize Google Analytics for. It can be quite frustrating. There's some bugs there, but always when you think about, hey, I need to look up for my client or for myself, how many visits did I have? Where did the users come from? How did this campaign perform? Maybe try out to find that in GA4 and open up the tool and get used to this. And then you will find that you might find that this is actually more convenient. So for example, funnel analysis, you can build very nice funnels now in GA4. That's not possible in UA. So building out a funnel in GA4 would be something that I would task everybody to do. And then at some point, you want to think about customizing your implementation and starting to actually send custom events into the system. So what is actually meaningful data to you? Send it in and then analyze it in there as well. At a later stage, you want to go out and build reporting out of this, maybe outside of GA4. So you could go this way. And yeah, depending on your workflow, what you're actually doing for the client, integrate GA4 slowly into your workflow. It's not yet there in terms of being able to do everything in GA4. But I think with time, we will see that there are new features introduced. We get more comfortable with it. And then we are ready for this change that will be coming in next year.
July 1st, 2023. Yes, and like you said, it's not quite there yet. GA4, some features are missing, but that's not to say universal analytics is perfect right now. Like it's nowhere near. Like Google Analytics 4, people complain it's not mature enough, it's not ready. I think it's better at this point than universal analytics. It's plain and simple. In 2022, this is a better tracking tool. Like there's no way around it, because just because it's familiar, like universal analytics, doesn't mean it's good for you. It doesn't mean it's the best solution. Now, is this a good time to consider choosing an alternative to Google? Because they're forcing you to start using a new tool. So there are a lot of tools out there. Mixpanel, HubSpot, Matomo, or Piwik Pro, like if you want to care about privacy. Is this a good time to actually strongly consider that, whether you need a stat counter or a real analytics tool?
Yeah. And that's an interesting question. A lot of people are actually considering it. And I'm always a fan of engaging in data, right? As long as people like think about their data, then we are making a step forward. So is it a good time? I guess so. Yes, it is a good time to maybe look at it. The question that then comes up is like, okay, which tool can you recommend? Well, that totally depends on what you would be using it for and how you would be using that data and what your concerns maybe are with Google Analytics 4. Now, just in terms of like what Google has going for it, and this may be something when you compare other tools. So first of all, it's free, right? That's the biggest plus point that they can probably throw out there, right? It's free and it has very good connections to Google. So if you are using AdWords, if you're using Google Optimize, if you are somebody who likes to work with the BigQuery connection, for example, or Data Studio, it's also a free solution, right? Then maybe you want to stick with Google because it provides you value. And that's also the important part. A tool will cost you something and you have switching costs and so on. But Google Analytics has certain features built in that you might not get in other tools. So if you're clear on that one and you don't want these features because you're not really using Google Ads and you don't really care about Data Studio being able to pull your data and you want to just use it as a stat counter, there are many other solutions out there. Once you go up market and you say, okay, we need to have something reliable that we can also build reports of and so on. A lot of tools are nowadays out there. If there are privacy concerns, you can look at privacy conscious tools that are on the market in Europe, for example. If you want to think about, hey, we don't really like the model of Google Analytics, there's certainly now the capability also to roll your own analytics infrastructure. This will require more maturity, more time, more more energy and a team actually to pull that off. But the components now with AWS and the Google Cloud and many other data vendors like Snowplow out there, they actually have solutions that you can build that up yourself. And so also startups that want to invest into this don't have to use Google Analytics 4. It is a solution, and the market is getting narrower, right? We had Google Analytics like kind of dominating this the market because it was a free solution and they gave us a lot of capabilities. But now I think as the market becomes more mature and we are actually using our data for something meaningful, it might make sense to look at different tools. I mean, it hurts my heart a little bit because we teach mainly the Google tools, but at the same time, I'm always a fan of engaging with the data. And if there's a tool out there that makes you engage more with the data, that makes you make more decisions with data, all the power to this tool, right? I wouldn't hold myself against it. If it works for you, then please use that tool.
I think that makes perfect sense. And it's really about starting with knowing what you want to track and knowing what you need the tool to do. Like you cannot choose a tool based on everyone's using it and based on it being free and expect that to be the perfect tool for you. I mean, that's kind of the difference between buying off the rack clothes and tailor-made clothes. Like, one is going to fit you better. There's no denying it's going to cost more. Like there's going to be more effort in setting it up, but you can't just expect perfection from Google Analytics because it's not made for you, it's made for everyone. With Google Analytics 4, with the data model, it's slightly different because you need to kind of customize it to your needs. But we'll see where this goes. I think it's a good thing. I think this is definitely a good change because we don't need 70% of websites having this tracking script just slapped on them without anyone checking what's going on, which is what do we have now, pretty much with UA. Now, you mentioned, and just in conclusion, if you want to get ready for July 1st, 2023, sounds like a lot of time. It will fly by. I'm sure a lot of people will be panicked June 2023 when the change is about to roll out. The first thing you want to do, set up a Google Analytics 4 property. Just get used to the interface, get familiar with it, see how it compares to UA. And I can bet that in 2024, people will not remember what UA interface looked like. I can bet anything I have that this will happen if it wasn't for the old blog post that explained how to do stuff in UA that will be around still. So in conclusion, to anyone who wants to learn about primarily Google products, they should go to measureschool.com. Can you tell me about Measure Masters? Like this is one of the products that you have, and what is it?
Yeah, Measure Masters is our main product, our only really product. It's a membership where we have different marketers in there that want to learn this data-driven way. And we mainly kind of specialize in educating a tracking specialist. So really helping them out to learn the art of tracking, because it's the art of like, how do you actually customize a tool to the business itself? And then go through the steps of also analyzing that data, so creating insights from data that you have measured, and then going the step beyond to actually taking it into action, right? How do you get other people to take action? So that's like kind of the flow of a tracking. I call it tracking specialist, but some people would call it a digital analyst. So there are different terms out there. But if you are interested in data and if you want to learn this kind of model of how to go through and actually drive from data to action, then yeah, check out Measure Masters. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard the expert. Go to measureschool.com, check out Measure Masters. You will learn about Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, the whole suite of Google products. Everything you need to know, you can find out at measureschool.com. Julian, thank you. It has been a pleasure to talk to you about this topic that people will be scared about in a year. And to everyone listening to this episode, I hope you've learned a lot, and I will talk to you next week.